His son's wife shoved his wife to the floor and sneered that she was filthy for daring to touch her own newborn grandson. The glass shattered, water spilled across the floor, and for a heartbeat the house went silent. In that silence the father's blood froze. He steadied his voice, looked his son straight in the eye, and uttered 3 words that would change everything. The room shook with the weight of those words, but it was only the beginning. Subscribe now and comment where you're watching from, because what happens next will leave you speechless. At 67, Richard never thought he would be the one standing in his own living room, questioning the very meaning of family. He had built his life on loyalty, sacrifice, and a stubborn belief that blood ties were unbreakable. Yet betrayal had forced him to confront truths he had pushed away for years. His son Daniel, the boy he had once carried on his shoulders through 4th of July parades, now treated him like a burden. Richard could still remember Daniel's small hands tugging at his shirt when he was a child, the way he begged for one more story before bed. That same boy now looked at him with a hardened gaze, a look that carried no trace of warmth. It was as if decades of fatherhood had been erased in the span of a single marriage. Richard replayed the years in his mind like an old film reel. When Daniel had first asked to move back home, Richard and his wife Linda hadn't hesitated. Times were tough, he said, and Clara, his new bride, wanted stability. They opened their door and handed over not just a room, but the entire foundation of their lives. They thought it was temporary, maybe a year at most, but 1 year stretched into 2, then into 8. 8 years of free rent, free meals, and endless sacrifices disguised as love. Richard had swallowed his pride each time he saw Clara rearrange furniture as if she owned the place or invite her friends over without asking. He told himself it was better to avoid conflict, better to let peace hang in the air, than to ignite flames of tension. But peace was never what it seemed. It was control. Slowly, piece by piece, they had chipped away at the home he had worked his whole life to build. He noticed how Clara would roll her eyes whenever Linda offered advice about the baby. He noticed how Daniel, once respectful, started echoing her tone, dismissing his mother's words as outdated. Richard told himself it was just the stress of parenthood, just a young couple learning their way. But deep down he knew it was more. It was rot spreading through the foundation of his family. On that day, the day the shove happened, Richard had been in his study polishing the wooden frame of a photograph. It was one of Linda, taken 30 years earlier, standing in front of their first house with Daniel clinging to her leg. Her smile was wide, her eyes bright with hope. He heard laughter in the living room, the sound of a baby's cooing, and for a brief second he felt something close to happiness. Then the laughter turned sharp, Clara's voice slicing through the air. The crash that followed made his chest tighten. He rushed out only to see the woman he had welcomed into his home towering over his wife, calling her filthy, as if she were nothing more than a nuisance. That image burned into him like a scar. Linda on the floor, clutching her wrist, flowers scattered across the hardwood water, soaking into the wood he had sanded with his own hands. Clara's voice still echoed, dripping with contempt. Daniel stood frozen, his silence cutting deeper than any insult. For Richard, that was the final nail. Silence was betrayal, and betrayal was unforgivable. He steadied his breath, stared into his son's eyes, and spoke 3 words that struck like a hammer. In the hours that followed, Richard sat alone in the kitchen. The clock ticked on the wall, each second a reminder of how far things had fallen. His wife sat quietly across from him, her face pale, her hands trembling. She tried to smile, tried to assure him that she was fine, but he knew better. Something inside her had broken. He saw it in her eyes, the same eyes that had once lit up at Christmas mornings, now dimmed with humiliation. That night Richard didn't sleep. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the last 8 years. He remembered the dinners he had paid for the debts he had covered, the vacations Clara insisted on, that drained his retirement savings. He thought of the mortgage he still carried, the one he had planned to pay off before handing the house down to Daniel. Now the idea of leaving anything to him felt like betrayal of his own values. The bitterness in Richard's chest wasn't just about the shove or the insult. It was about every sacrifice dismissed, every ounce of respect stripped away. At dawn, he rose quietly, poured himself a cup of coffee, and walked out onto the porch. The air was sharp with morning cold, the kind that clung to his lungs. He stared at the yard he had mowed for decades, the fence he had painted with his own hands. He thought about how much he had given and how little it meant. He realized then that family was not measured by blood alone, but by respect. Without respect, there was nothing left but ashes. As the sun climbed, he felt a steadiness he hadn't known in years. His hands no longer shook, his voice no longer wavered. He understood that the time for silence had passed. He could no longer protect Daniel from the weight of his own choices. The house, the life, the years of sacrifice, none of it would be handed over freely again. Richard knew what he had to do, and he knew it would cut deep. When Linda stepped onto the porch, her eyes red but her back straight, he saw a glimmer of the woman he had fallen in love with. She didn't need to say a word. He nodded once, a silent promise that this betrayal would not be the end. It would be the beginning of something else, something his son and Clara would never forget. And as he sipped his coffee, the bitter taste sharp on his tongue, he thought of the blueprint forming in his mind. Every line, every decision, every strike, carefully measured. He had spent a lifetime building. Now he would teach them what it meant to lose. What came next would not just be a lesson, it would be a reckoning. 8 years earlier, Daniel had shown up with Clara and a single suitcase, his face drawn, his words shaky. He said it was temporary, a short stay until they found their footing. Richard had looked at Linda, and she had nodded without hesitation. Of course they would take them in. That was what family did. Richard had worked his entire life in construction, saved, carefully built the house brick by brick, a fortress meant to keep his family safe. Opening its doors to his only son felt natural, almost expected. But what started as a gesture of kindness soon turned into something else, something that gnawed at the walls of the house like termites eating through wood. At first, Clara played the role of the grateful daughter-in-law. She offered to cook, to clean, to help with small chores. Her laugh was light, her words honeyed. Richard almost believed she appreciated the roof over her head, the meals Linda prepared, the bills he continued to pay. But over time the mask slipped. Her laugh turned sharp, her requests turned into demands, and her presence spread through the house like smoke. One by one the rooms changed. A photograph of Richard's parents was replaced with one of Clara's family. The sturdy oak dining table he had built in his garage workshop was covered in lace cloth and centerpieces she insisted on buying. The living room became hers, decorated with pastel cushions and scented candles that clashed with the smell of sawdust he carried home on his clothes. Daniel, caught between loyalty and convenience, leaned toward the path of least resistance. Richard watched his son change. He spoke differently, with Clara's clipped tone, dismissive of his parents' opinions. The boy who once asked for his father's advice on everything from car repairs to job interviews now acted as though Richard's voice carried no weight. Richard saw it most in the evenings when he would sit in his chair by the window, a glass of bourbon in hand, while Daniel laughed in the kitchen with Clara, their voices rising, shutting him out. Linda, ever patient, told him to let it go, to give them time. She believed harmony could still be saved. Richard, though, felt something slipping away, as if his own son was slowly moving out of reach even while living under his roof. Months turned into years, and the burden grew heavier. Richard paid the mortgage, the utilities, the groceries, even as Clara criticized the meals, complained about the air conditioning, and insisted they needed more space. She talked about the house as if it were hers, dropping comments about renovations, about knocking down walls, about transforming the backyard into a garden for her parties. Richard would bite his tongue, his jaw tight, as if silence could hold the house together. But silence was becoming harder to maintain. The worst of it was the way Clara treated Linda. Small slights, at first hidden behind smiles. A dismissive tone when Linda offered to help, a mocking laugh when she made a suggestion about the nursery. Then it became sharper, crueler. She told Linda to keep quiet when guests came over. She told her not to hover around the baby once he was born. She told her in her own house that she should be grateful to be included at all. Richard saw the way his wife's shoulders slumped, the way she folded her hands in her lap to keep from shaking. Each time something inside him burned hotter, but he swallowed it down. He told himself there would be a time, a place to speak. Clara grew bolder with each passing month. She brought her parents over for weekends as if the house belonged to them too. They lounged in his living room, drank his bourbon, and spoke with smug assurance about how Daniel and Clara were building their future here. Richard sat in the corner, listening, each word landing like a nail hammered into his patience. It wasn't generosity anymore. It was occupation. His home had become theirs, his authority dismantled piece by piece until all that remained was the shell of a man who had once built and provided. One night Richard stood in the garage, the smell of oil and wood shavings clinging to the air. He stared at his tools lined neatly on the wall, the hammer, the saw, the level. Instruments of order and creation, symbols of a life spent building. But even as they hung there untouched, he felt powerless in his own house. That night he didn't sleep. He walked the halls quietly, listening to the sounds of Clara's laughter drifting from the bedroom that used to be Daniel's alone. The walls felt thinner, the air colder. He realized the house no longer echoed with the comfort of family. It reverberated with tension, with ownership he hadn't granted, with entitlement that had poisoned everything. Richard thought about the day Daniel was born, how he had painted the nursery himself, sky blue with tiny white clouds. He thought about the promises he had made as a young father to protect, to provide, to never let his son feel abandoned. And yet here he was, abandoned in spirit by the very boy he had raised. The generosity that once made him proud now mocked him. It had created a monster not just in Clara, but in the complacency of his son. As dawn broke, Richard stood again on the porch, coffee cooling in his hand. The yard stretched out before him, the fence casting long shadows across the grass. He realized that kindness without boundaries was not kindness at all. It was surrender. He had surrendered his peace, his authority, his respect, and for what? For a son who couldn't even defend his own mother, for a daughter-in-law who saw them as nothing but stepping stones. The bitterness settled deep in his chest, but beneath it stirred something else. Something colder. A new resolve. Richard knew that generosity had backfired, but the story wasn't over. Not yet. He could feel the blueprint of a plan taking shape, every line sharp, every detail deliberate. What came next would not be charity. It would be justice. And Daniel and Clara were about to learn that the foundation they had taken for granted was never theirs to claim. Richard and Linda had always lived by a simple creed: family should help family. It was the bedrock of their marriage, the compass that guided every choice they made. When Daniel was young, they took in his cousins after their parents divorced, crowding the small house with extra mattresses and noisy dinners, because no child in the family was ever going to feel alone. When Linda's brother lost his job, Richard gave him work on his construction sites, even when it meant taking home less pay. That was who they were. That was what family meant. So when Daniel and Clara came knocking, there was never a question. Their door opened wide, their hearts wider still. Daniel was their only child, the boy who carried their legacy, the one who was supposed to inherit not just the house, but the values it was built upon. To Richard and Linda, saying no to him felt unnatural, like denying oxygen. They poured themselves into making his life easier. Richard picked up extra shifts to cover expenses Daniel couldn't manage. Linda quietly slipped grocery money into his wallet when Clara wasn't looking. They told themselves it was temporary, a bridge to help Daniel cross into stability, into manhood, into the kind of responsibility Richard had carried since his 20s. The house became a shared space in theory, but a surrendered one in practice. Linda cooked meals large enough for 4 stretching recipes she had once made for just 2. Richard gave up his evenings at the VFW hall to babysit their grandson, believing he was strengthening the bond between generations. He even offered to remodel the basement into an apartment so Daniel and Clara could have their own space, sinking thousands into insulation, wiring new flooring, all of it justified under the banner of family unity. And every dollar spent, every compromise made, he told himself was an investment in love, in loyalty, in the unbreakable chain between parent and child. But the reality was far less noble. Clara treated their kindness as entitlement. Daniel, softened by years of indulgence, no longer noticed the sacrifices at all. Richard watched his jaw tight as his son slipped further from the values he was raised on. He remembered teaching Daniel how to hammer a nail straight, how to measure twice and cut once, how to treat every tool with respect, because tools like people could break if mishandled. Those lessons seemed long forgotten. Now Daniel measured nothing, rushed everything, and treated his parents' generosity as if it were bottomless. Linda still clung to hope. She believed if they just kept giving, eventually Daniel would see the truth. She reminded Richard of family gatherings in the past, of the joy in Daniel's face when he came home from college for Thanksgiving, of the nights he stayed up talking with them about his dreams. She believed those moments could return. Richard, though, began to see a different pattern. Each act of help only widened the gap. Each dollar spent only deepened the expectation. He knew they weren't building bridges anymore. They were laying chains. There were nights Richard sat awake long after Linda had gone to bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning above him, wondering if he had made a mistake somewhere along the way. Maybe he had been too soft, too willing to bend. Maybe his idea of family unity had blinded him to the truth. Unity only worked when everyone respected the bond. Without respect, it was just dependency wrapped in sentiment. He thought about his own father, a stern man who believed discipline was love. Richard had sworn he would never be that hard, that unyielding. But now he wondered if maybe his father had seen something he had missed. The house itself became a battleground for these beliefs. Every corner carried echoes of both love and resentment. Richard's work boots sat by the back door, worn from decades of labor, while Clara's designer shoes lined the front hall like trophies. Linda's knitted blankets draped over the couch, while Clara's scented candles burned away their familiar smell. Even the air felt divided, a clash between tradition and intrusion. Richard told himself it was worth it, that one day Daniel would understand that blood ties were stronger than petty grievances. But the doubt gnawed at him, a quiet whisper that perhaps he had built his house on shifting sand. The breaking point came slowly, not in a single explosion, but in 1,000 small fractures. Richard noticed Daniel stopped saying thank you, stopped asking if they were okay with decisions, stopped seeing the house as theirs at all. Clara began referring to rooms as if they were already hers, the nursery, the guest room, even Richard's study. Linda would flinch at the words, but she would force a smile, repeating the mantra, family should help family. Richard stayed silent, but inside something cold was taking root. He thought of the times he had watched families crumble around him. Neighbors who stopped speaking after an inheritance fight. Brothers who never reconciled after a dispute over land. He had always believed he would be different, that his family would never splinter. But the evidence was all around him. His generosity had not inspired gratitude. It had invited contempt. His unity had not created strength. It had fostered weakness. One evening he stepped outside into the yard, the cicadas buzzing in the warm night air. He looked at the house glowing in the darkness, the same house he had bled for, sweated for, dreamed for. Inside he could hear Clara laughing, Daniel's voice mingling with hers. It struck him then with brutal clarity, they weren't laughing with him, they were laughing without him, and perhaps, just perhaps, at him. Richard tightened his grip on the porch railing, the wood rough under his palm. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine what life would look like if unity wasn't the answer. What if the only way to restore respect was not through giving, but through taking? The thought chilled him, but it also steadied him, because deep down he knew a reckoning was coming, and when it arrived it would not be gentle. It would be exact, deliberate, and unforgettable. What waited just beyond that night was a decision that would turn their fragile idea of family into something far more dangerous. For nearly a decade, Richard and Linda carried the weight of a household that no longer felt like theirs. The mortgage, the utilities, the endless repairs that came with an old house, it all came from Richard's pocket. He still rose before dawn, his body aching with the stiffness of age, and went out to oversee construction projects long after he should have been retired. He told himself he was doing it for his family, that Daniel would one day recognize the sacrifices his father made. But Daniel's gratitude had evaporated like morning mist. The boy who once admired his father's strength now walked through the halls as though the house had always belonged to him. Clara grew more comfortable with each passing year. She took over closets and cabinets, filling them with clothes she bought on Richard's dime. She spoke of the kitchen as if it had always been hers, moving Linda's carefully arranged cookware to the back shelves and replacing them with expensive appliances she never used. Her voice carried through the house like a siren, sharp and commanding, drowning out the quiet steadiness that had once defined the home. And through it all she never once acknowledged the sacrifices made for her comfort. Richard noticed the small humiliations that piled up, the way Clara would roll her eyes when Linda offered to help with the baby, the way she complained about the quality of the groceries, even though Richard paid for every bag. He watched Linda shrink in her own home, her laughter less frequent, her steps quieter. She had always been the heart of the house, humming while she cooked, telling stories at the dinner table, knitting blankets during winter evenings. Now she carried herself like a guest overstaying her welcome. The financial burden grew heavier as Clara's demands multiplied. She wanted new curtains, new furniture, weekend getaways to resorts she chose without asking. Daniel, blinded by her influence, defended every extravagance. He told Richard it was natural to provide, that as parents they should be happy to help. Richard bit back the anger rising in his chest, swallowing it like poison, telling himself silence was strength. But silence came at a cost. Bills piled up on Richard's desk, reminders of the life he had deferred. His savings account, once meant for retirement trips with Linda, dwindled into a shadow. The dream of buying an RV and driving across the country, of seeing the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone together, slipped further out of reach. Instead of freedom, he worked for the illusion of family unity, sacrificing the last years of his strength to a son who had forgotten the meaning of respect. There were moments when Richard almost broke his silence. He would sit at the head of the dinner table, his fork heavy in his hand, listening to Clara criticize the way Linda seasoned the food, or hearing Daniel dismiss his advice about fixing the leaky faucet. The words rose to his lips, sharp and unyielding, but each time Linda's pleading eyes stopped him. She still clung to the hope that their sacrifices would bring Daniel closer, that love would eventually outweigh entitlement. Richard stayed quiet for her sake, but inside his patience was crumbling. One winter evening Richard came home late, his boots caked with mud from a construction site. He found Clara lounging on the couch, scrolling her phone while Linda cleared dishes from the dinner Daniel and Clara had shared without inviting him. Richard stood in the doorway, the cold air still clinging to his jacket, and watched as his wife carried plates to the sink. Her back bent, her hands trembling with fatigue. Clara didn't even glance up. The sight carved into him like a blade. This was not what he had built his life for. This was not the family he had dreamed of raising. The quiet sacrifices had twisted into something darker. Every dollar spent, every meal cooked, every chore endured, had not brought them closer together, but had instead widened the chasm between them. Richard realized he was no longer a father in Daniel's eyes, but a wallet, no longer a man in Clara's eyes, but a servant bound by obligation. He had given without measure, and in return he had been stripped of dignity. Late that night, Richard stood alone in his study, the only room left untouched by Clara's hand. The shelves lined with books, the smell of leather and old wood, the faint ticking of the clock. It was the last sanctuary of his identity. He stared at the framed photograph of Daniel as a child, smiling with a gap-toothed grin, a boy who once believed his father could fix anything. He whispered to the empty room, asking where that boy had gone, wondering if he had been lost forever. For nearly a decade, Richard had endured in silence, believing sacrifice was love. But now, as he looked at the hollowed-out shell of his family, he understood that sacrifice without recognition was nothing but surrender. And he knew with a certainty as sharp as steel that surrender was no longer an option. The years of quiet suffering were ending. What lay ahead would not be silence, but something far more decisive, something that would shake Daniel and Clara to their core. It was a Tuesday like any other, the kind of morning that should have been uneventful, steady, comforting in its routine. Linda stood in the kitchen, her silver hair tucked behind her ears, humming a tune she had loved since her youth. She filled a vase with fresh flowers she had picked up at the market, their fragrance filling the air with a sweetness that belonged to simpler times. At 73, she had learned to find joy in small gestures, the quiet rituals of care that made a house feel alive. She placed the flowers on the table and stepped back to admire them, her eyes soft, her smile calm. For a brief moment it felt like peace still lived there. Then the cry of their newborn grandson pierced through the air, sharp and insistent, carrying with it a weight that seemed to bend the walls. Linda's heart lifted. She loved that sound, raw and demanding proof of new life and the continuation of the family she had devoted her entire existence to. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the nursery with a tenderness that only grandmothers possess. But before she could reach the door, another voice cut through the air, louder, harsher, dripping with disdain. Clara's voice. "Don't you dare go near him!" Clara snapped, her tones slicing like broken glass. Linda froze, startled by the venom in those words. She blinked, unable to understand why such hostility filled the space that should have been sacred. Richard, sitting in the den with the morning paper, lifted his head, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. He set the paper down slowly, every muscle in his body tightening as if bracing for an earthquake. Linda took another careful step forward, her hands open, her voice soft. "I just wanted to help, to hold him for a moment." The answer came not with words, but with action. Clara shoved her back hard enough that Linda stumbled into the hallway wall. The vase of flowers tipped over in the kitchen, shattering on the tile floor, water seeping into the cracks like blood spreading across fabric. The baby's cries grew louder, echoing like an alarm. Richard was on his feet in an instant, his blood surging cold as he crossed the room. The sight that met him seared itself into his memory. His wife, the woman who had given her entire life to nurturing others, sprawled against the wall, her face pale, her eyes wide with humiliation. Clara stood above her, clutching the baby tightly, her lips curled into a sneer. And Daniel, his own son, stood motionless, frozen in silence, offering no defense, no rebuke, nothing. The betrayal in that silence cut deeper than the shove, deeper than the insult. Richard's jaw tightened, his breath steadying into something dangerous. He bent down, helping Linda to her feet, his touch gentle against her trembling shoulder. Then he lifted his gaze and met Daniel's eyes with a stare sharp enough to strip the air from the room. "You need to control her," Richard said, his voice low, each word deliberate, sharp as a blade. But Daniel didn't answer. He only looked away, his shame disguised as cowardice. Clara smirked, emboldened by his silence. Linda whispered, her voice trembling. Richard let it go. But he couldn't. Not this time. Something inside him had snapped a cord stretched too thin for too long. The house, once a place of warmth, had become a stage for humiliation. Every photograph on the walls, every piece of furniture carried the weight of memory of sacrifice. And now, those very walls bore witness to betrayal. Richard's mind raced back through the years. The mortgage payments, the dinners paid for the basement, remodeled for their comfort, the countless acts of generosity that had been twisted into expectation. And this was how they repaid it. He turned back toward Daniel, his voice steady, almost calm, though it carried the force of thunder. "This ends today." The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara shifted the baby in her arms, rolling her eyes as if Richard were nothing more than a nuisance. Daniel muttered something under his breath, but it wasn't an apology. It wasn't defense. It was avoidance. That avoidance lit a fire in Richard's chest. Linda clutched his arm, her eyes pleading, but Richard's gaze remained fixed on his son. In that moment, he knew the man standing before him wasn't the boy he had raised. This man was a stranger hollowed out by weakness and shaped by the sharp edges of a woman who saw kindness as something to exploit. The cry of the baby softened into hiccups, but the echo of betrayal lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Richard guided Linda back into the kitchen, stepping over the shards of broken glass, the petals scattered like fallen promises. He sat her down, poured her a glass of water, and brushed the dust from her sleeve. His movements were gentle, but inside a storm raged. This was not simply disrespect, it was erasure. The years of sacrifice, the very foundation of family, had been dismissed in a single cruel moment. Richard felt it settle in his bones, the realization that kindness had been mistaken for weakness, that silence had been taken as surrender. And now the cost of that surrender had come due. He looked at Linda, the lines on her face etched deeper by the morning's humiliation, and felt the weight of a promise he hadn't yet spoken. He would not allow this to continue. He would not let her suffer in the house they had built together. Outside, the world carried on as if nothing had happened. A dog barked down the street, a delivery truck rumbled past, the sun climbed higher into the sky. But inside, the air was heavy, charged electric with the knowledge that something had shifted forever. Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the window, his reflection staring back at him. The man who looked at him wasn't broken. He was sharpened, hardened, ready. The morning of betrayal had ended, but what lay beyond it was no longer uncertainty. It was inevitability. And when Richard finally moved, it would not be in silence. It would be with precision, with finality, with a reckoning that Daniel and Clara would never see coming. Clara's voice sliced through the air with the sharpness of a knife, her irritation spilling out like venom. She stood in the middle of the living room, clutching the baby as if possession of the child gave her authority over the house itself. "Can you keep it down? Every little sound is waking him," she snapped, her tone laced with contempt. Linda had merely hummed, while folding laundry, the same soft tune she had hummed for decades, the kind of melody that once soothed Daniel when he was an infant. Now it was treated as an offense, an intrusion. Richard stood by the doorway, his hands curling into fists at his sides. This was his home, yet he felt like an intruder in the space he had built with his own 2 hands. Clara's demands multiplied with every passing day. She criticized the way Linda walked through the halls, claimed the creak of the floorboards under her steps disturbed the baby's sleep. She demanded the television remain off during the evenings, as if Richard's quiet habit of watching the news at 7 was an act of sabotage. Even the clink of silverware during dinner became grounds for her sharp remarks. Nothing escaped her scrutiny, and every word dripped with the entitlement of someone who had never sacrificed a thing for the roof over her head. Richard began to notice the shift in Daniel. His son, once quick to defend his parents, now echoed Clara's complaints with a weary nod or a dismissive shrug. When Richard tried to speak up, Daniel would sigh heavily, telling him not to make things harder, insisting Clara was just stressed. It was easier for him to placate his wife than to stand up for his mother. Richard felt the sting of betrayal each time Daniel's silence endorsed Clara's cruelty. The boy he had raised to respect his elders now stood idle, while his wife dismantled every thread of dignity left in the house. The demands themselves were small on the surface, but they added up like drops of acid eating through stone. No more cooking with onions because the smell bothered Clara. No more phone calls on the landline because the ringing startled the baby. No more visitors without Clara's approval because the house needed to remain peaceful. Piece by piece, Richard and Linda's lives were carved away until all that remained was a hollow existence of tiptoeing through their own home. One evening, Richard returned from a long day at work to find Clara seated at the dining table scrolling through her phone while Linda quietly ate her dinner at the far end. Clara looked up and announced, "We've decided to convert the study into a second nursery. The baby needs more space." Richard's jaw tightened. His study was the last untouched corner of his life, a place where he could still feel like himself. He stared at her, the audacity of the declaration burning through him. "We've decided," he asked, his voice low, dangerous. Clara didn't flinch. She smirked, adjusting the baby on her hip, and replied, "It's what makes sense. You hardly use it." That night, Richard sat in the study long after everyone had gone to bed. He traced the grain of the oak desk he had built himself, remembered the late nights drafting blueprints and balancing books. The room smelled of paper and old leather, of years of work and memory. He realized then that Clara wasn't just making unreasonable demands, she was claiming territory, erasing his presence one room at a time. Linda tried to reassure him, whispering that it wasn't worth the fight, that maybe it was easier to let Clara have her way. But Richard could see the toll it was taking on her. He caught her staring at the wedding photograph on the wall, her expression hollow, her lips pressed tight. The woman who once filled the house with warmth now moved like a shadow, afraid of setting off Clara's next complaint. That was what broke him most of all. Clara wasn't just disrespecting them. She was extinguishing Linda's spirit one insult at a time. The days grew heavier, the house quieter. Richard felt the weight pressing down on him each time Clara's voice rang out with another demand, another order in a place she hadn't built, hadn't earned. He began to see her not as a daughter-in-law, but as an intruder, a usurper cloaked in the thin veil of family. The more she spoke, the more he realized the truth. Clara didn't want peace. She wanted control. One Sunday morning, as Richard brewed coffee in the kitchen, Clara entered with a stack of catalogs. She spread them across the table, pointing at furniture she intended to buy, curtains she planned to hang, renovations she wanted to make. She spoke as though she were the owner, as though Richard were merely the handyman tasked with carrying out her vision. Linda sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. Richard listened, his jaw tight, his patience unraveling thread by thread. It became clear to him that the house was no longer a home. It was a battleground disguised as domestic life, every unreasonable demand another strike in Clara's quiet war of conquest. Richard knew he could not continue to endure it. He could not allow Linda to be diminished further, nor could he allow his own identity to be erased in the place he had built with sweat and sacrifice. That night, as he sat in his study with the door locked, Richard felt a shift inside him. He stared at the old family photographs, at the tools of his trade, at the life he had carved from nothing. Clara's voice still echoed in his ears, sharp and grating, but for the first time he didn't feel powerless. He felt clarity. He realized the days of tolerating her demands were over. The unreasonable demands had pushed him to the edge, but what lay beyond that edge was not resignation. It was resolve. And when Richard finally chose to act, his response would be measured not in words but in consequences Clara and Daniel could never have imagined. Linda had spent weeks preparing in quiet, tender ways. She folded the baby clothes with the same care she once gave to Daniel's little shirts and socks, smoothing out every wrinkle, setting them in neat stacks inside a cedar chest she had kept since her wedding day. She polished the handles until they gleamed as though shining them might somehow pass down a blessing. She set aside a corner of their bedroom, clearing away her knitting basket and an old rocking chair so there would be room for a bassinet. She wanted her grandson close, where she could rise in the night to rock him, where her lullabies could fill the silence with love. Her heart brimmed with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. At 73, joy often came in small doses, but the thought of holding her first grandchild brought back a flood of life that made her feel young again. She had shopped carefully, choosing soft flannel blankets in pale blues and yellows onesies, with little bears stitched on the chest, and a pair of tiny socks that fit in the palm of her hand. Each item seemed to promise a way to say, "You are welcome here. You are loved." She imagined the look on Daniel's face when he saw the space, how he might remember the nights she once stayed up rocking him when he was sick, how he might see his mother's love carrying forward to his child. She imagined Clara softening too, seeing not an adversary but a grandmother whose only wish was to give. But Linda's excitement was met not with gratitude, but with scorn. When Clara noticed the neatly folded clothes stacked on the dresser, her lips curled into disdain. "We don't need your hand-me-downs," she said sharply, even though the clothes were brand new. When she saw the cleared corner of the bedroom, her voice rose louder, dripping with contempt. "This is ridiculous. You can't just set up your own nursery like you're the mother." Richard stood nearby, his jaw tightening as Clara's words cut through the air. He saw the way Linda's smile faltered, the way her hands trembled slightly, as she adjusted the blanket draped over the bassinet. He knew how much care had gone into every choice, every stitch of preparation, and to see it dismissed so callously was like watching someone step on a flower just beginning to bloom. Daniel didn't defend his mother. He shifted uncomfortably, rubbed the back of his neck, and mumbled something about how Clara had her own plans for the nursery. His silence struck harder than Clara's words. Richard had always known his son could be weak, but he hadn't expected him to stand idle while his wife humiliated his mother. Linda tried to brush it off, her voice soft, almost apologetic. "I just thought it might be nice to have him close when you need rest." I thought maybe Clara cut her off, her tone sharp and final. "What you thought doesn't matter. This is my baby. My decisions." The air went cold. Richard could feel his pulse in his temples, the weight of silence pressing on him. He looked at his wife, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, her shoulders drawn in as if to make herself smaller. Her excitement, once radiant, now dimmed under the weight of rejection. That night Linda sat in the corner of the bedroom she had prepared, running her fingers over the fabric of the baby clothes, her lips pressed tight. She tried to convince herself that Clara was just tired, that new motherhood made people harsh. But deep inside she felt something fracture. The joy she had carried was slipping, replaced by an ache that was hard to name. Richard lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling. He thought of all the years Linda had devoted to making their home warm, to making Daniel's life easier, to keeping their family whole. And now, in the moment when she should have been celebrated, she was treated like an intruder. He clenched his fists beneath the blanket, the quiet fury building in his chest. He wanted to tell her that Clara's cruelty was not her fault, that her love was not wasted, that her anticipation was real and valid. But he also knew words were not enough anymore. The next morning, Linda folded the baby clothes back into the cedar chest, her movements slower, heavier. She closed the lid and pressed her palm against the polished wood, as though sealing away not just the clothes but her hope. Richard watched her, his chest tight, and understood that something had shifted irrevocably. Linda's excitement had been pure innocence born from love. But Clara's reaction had poisoned it, turning anticipation into sorrow. Richard felt the shift inside himself, too. He had been patient, tolerant, willing to endure slights for the sake of peace. But seeing Linda's joy crushed so cruelly made patience feel like betrayal. The house was no longer just filled with unreasonable demands. It was a place where even love was treated like an offense. And Richard knew with cold certainty that the day was coming when his silence would end. What Clara dismissed as harmless preparations would become the very spark that ignited something far greater, something she would never be able to control. The crash split the air like a gunshot, jolting Richard from his chair. He rushed into the hallway, his breath catching as his eyes locked onto the scene unfolding before him. Linda was sprawled on the floor, her arm twisted awkwardly against the wall, petals scattered like broken promises, water seeping across the hardwood in a dark stain. Clara stood above her, the baby clutched to her chest, her eyes burning with contempt. Her words slithered through the silence, cold and venomous. "Don't touch him. You're dirty." Time seemed to slow. Richard's vision tunneled, his focus narrowing on the image of his wife, humiliated and trembling, while Clara loomed with an arrogance that made the air unbreathable. He bent down, his hand brushing against Linda's arm, feeling the tremor running through her body. She tried to push herself upright, her dignity intact even as her eyes shimmered with tears she refused to shed. Richard steadied her, his hands strong, deliberate, then turned his gaze upward. Clara met his eyes with a smirk, her lips curled in triumph. She didn't flinch, didn't soften as though the insult was her birthright. The baby whimpered, unsettled by the tension, but she rocked him with an indifference that chilled Richard's blood. Then he looked at Daniel. His son stood frozen, hands shoved in his pockets, his expression a mixture of discomfort and cowardice. He didn't defend his mother. He didn't rebuke his wife. He just stood there, allowing the venom to seep deeper into the walls of the house. That silence, that refusal to act, pierced Richard more than Clara's words. Betrayal often wears no mask. It reveals itself in absence, in the emptiness where loyalty should stand. Richard's voice cut through the tension, low and measured, every syllable weighted like iron. "Pick your mother up," he said to Daniel. But Daniel didn't move. His eyes darted toward Clara, searching for her approval. And Richard saw the truth in that glance. His son belonged to her now, not to the family that had built him, not to the parents who had carried him through every storm. Linda rose slowly with Richard's help, her body fragile but her resolve steady. She wouldn't give Clara the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. She smoothed her blouse with trembling fingers, lifted her chin, and whispered, "I'm fine." But Richard knew she wasn't fine. The wound Clara had inflicted wasn't on the body, but on the soul, and it cut deeper than any bruise. The silence stretched thick and suffocating until Richard broke it. "This is my house," he said, his voice sharp, reverberating against the walls. Clara rolled her eyes, shifting the baby higher on her shoulder. "Your house," she scoffed. "You hardly live here. You're just in the way." The audacity of it struck like a blade. Richard's blood pounded in his ears, his jaw tightening as he steadied himself. He had built this house brick by brick, board by board. Every corner carried his sweat, every nail his hand. For Clara to dismiss it, to dismiss him, was more than insolence. It was war declared under his own roof. Daniel finally spoke, his voice quiet but cutting. "Maybe Clara's right. Maybe you should give us some space." The words fell heavy, their weight crushing. Richard stared at him, searching for the boy who once clung to his leg, who once begged for bedtime stories, who once believed his father could fix anything. But that boy was gone. What stood before him was a man hollowed by weakness, molded by a woman who wielded disdain like a weapon. Linda touched Richard's arm gently, her eyes pleading for calm, but his rage simmered too deep to be silenced. He could feel something shifting inside him, the quiet patience that had defined him for years hardening into steel. Clara mistook his silence for surrender. Daniel mistook it for weakness. Neither saw the storm gathering in his eyes. Richard helped Linda back into the kitchen, stepping over the broken stems and the puddle spreading across the floor. Each step echoed with resolve. He sat her down, brushing her hair gently from her face, his touch tender even as fury burned inside him. She whispered, "Let it go." But he knew he couldn't. Not this time. The house was no longer a home. It was a battlefield, and Clara had drawn the first blood. Richard understood what had just happened was not an isolated cruelty, but a declaration. He looked at his wife, saw the hurt she tried to mask, and made a promise without speaking it aloud. The insult would not be forgotten. The shove would not be forgiven. The silence of his son would not go unanswered. And as Richard stood in the dim light of the kitchen, his reflection caught in the window pane, he realized the man staring back at him was no longer willing to endure. The reckoning had begun, and when it came, it would leave no doubt about who truly owned the walls that surrounded them. Linda sat in the chair Richard pulled out for her, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her body trembling in silence. The house around her was the same one she had scrubbed and polished for over 40 years, the same kitchen where she had cooked thousands of meals, where birthdays had been celebrated, where Daniel had once blown out candles with frosting smeared across his cheeks. Yet now, in that same house, she felt like a stranger, no worse than a stranger. She felt like an intruder who had overstayed her welcome. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but none of them came from the shove. None of them from the sting in her shoulder or the ache in her knees. They came from the humiliation from being reduced to nothing more than an inconvenience in the space she had fought to preserve for decades. Richard watched her carefully, his own rage buried beneath the steady rhythm of his breathing. He could see it in her eyes, the fracture that Clara had driven deep into her soul. She had always carried herself with dignity, with the quiet strength of a woman who could weather storms without flinching. To see her reduced to this, to silence, to shame, was more than he could bear. Clara lingered in the doorway, still holding the baby like a trophy, her smirk sharp enough to cut glass. She had won this round, and she knew it. Daniel hovered behind her, saying nothing, doing nothing, his silence louder than any insult. Richard looked at him and felt a hollowness spread through his chest. His son's eyes refused to meet his as though cowardice could be hidden by averting a gaze. That avoidance was betrayal in its purest form. Linda forced a small smile, whispering that she was fine, but Richard knew the truth. She was anything but fine. He had spent a lifetime learning her expressions, the way her lips trembled when she tried to hold back tears, the way her fingers twisted in her lap when she felt powerless. He reached out and placed his hand over hers, steady and firm, grounding her in the moment. She squeezed it back weakly, her touch saying what her words could not. This was not just pain, it was erasure. The room still carried the smell of the spilled flowers, a sweetness tainted by the bitterness in the air. The petals lay across the floor like casualties of war, the water seeping into the hardwood Richard had refinished with his own hands. Each stain felt like a mark of Clara's victory, a claim of ownership in a place she had never earned. Linda's humiliation was not just hers to bear, it was theirs, a wound carved into the very heart of their home. Richard's silence stretched, but it was not the silence of surrender. It was the silence of calculation. Every humiliation, every slight, every insult had been written into his memory like entries in a ledger. And he knew that ledgers always needed to be balanced. As Linda sat there, her shoulders hunched, her spirit dimmed, Richard felt the weight of every sacrifice they had made for Daniel. The bills paid, the meals cooked, the nights spent worrying. And for what? To be treated like servants in their own home, to be dismissed as burdens when all they had done was give. He wanted to tell Linda that this was not her fault, that she was not unwanted, that her love had been pure and unwavering. But he also knew that words meant nothing now. Action would be the only language Clara and Daniel understood. Clara's footsteps echoed down the hall as she retreated, leaving behind the sour taste of victory. Daniel followed her like a shadow, offering no glance back, no apology, no acknowledgement of the devastation left in his wake. The house grew quiet again, but the quiet was different now. It was heavy, suffocating, thick with the humiliation Linda carried and the fury Richard refused to release. Linda stood after a long moment, gathering the broken stems from the floor with shaking hands. Richard bent down beside her, gently taking the pieces away. "Leave it," he said, his voice low but firm. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, trying to understand the resolve she saw there. For the first time in years, Richard's expression was unyielding, carved from stone. That night Linda moved through the house like a ghost, her footsteps light, her voice absent. Richard sat alone in his study, staring at the wedding photo on his desk. The two of them, younger, unbroken, filled with dreams. He traced the frame with his fingers, the reflection of himself staring back in the glass. He wondered when silence had become their enemy, when patience had turned into permission for cruelty. Humiliation in one's own home is more than insult, it is theft. Clara had stolen something intangible yet vital. Linda's dignity, Richard's authority, the sanctity of the home itself. And Richard understood now that he could not allow the theft to continue. When he stepped out of the study, the house was dark, the only sound the ticking of the clock in the hall. He paused at the doorway of the bedroom where Linda lay sleeping fitfully, her hand curled beneath her chin, her face drawn with worry, even in rest. He made a silent promise to her in that moment, a vow etched into the marrow of his bones. The humiliation she had endured would not be forgotten, nor forgiven. It would be answered. And when it was the memory of this night, the shattered flowers, the venomous words, the look in her eyes would be the spark that lit the fire. What Clara believed was triumph was only the beginning. What waited beyond the humiliation was a reckoning so precise, so devastating it would strip away every illusion she held of control. Richard pulled Linda gently to her feet, his hand steadying her trembling frame. He felt the weight of her humiliation pressing through his palm, and when his eyes lifted to Clara, standing tall with the baby, cradled smugly in her arms, he saw at the flicker of satisfaction the smirk she didn't bother to hide. It was there in the curl of her lip, in the tilt of her chin, in the way she glanced at Daniel as though she had won something permanent. That look snapped something inside Richard. something buried beneath decades of patience and sacrifice. It wasn't a burst of fiery anger, but something colder, sharper, more dangerous. His fury didn't roar. It froze steady as a blade held against an enemy's throat. In that instant he saw the truth laid bare. This was no longer his home. The house he had built, paid for, and protected had been quietly overtaken not by force of arms, but by manipulation, cowardice, and silence. Clara stood there like a conqueror claiming territory, and Daniel, his own son, stood at her side like a willing accomplice. The realization sliced through him. Their kindness, their sacrifices had not only been dismissed, they had been weaponized against them. His generosity had become his defeat. Richard guided Linda to a chair in the kitchen, his movements calm, deliberate, concealing the storm rising inside. He brushed the dust from her sleeve, his touch tender, but his eyes never softened. Clara thought his silence meant surrender, that his measured steps were signs of weakness. Daniel, too, seemed convinced his father had been broken, that he would retreat into quiet compliance as he always had. Neither of them saw what truly lived behind his eyes, now resolve as immovable as stone. He stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Clara retreat down the hall, still clutching the baby, still issuing sharp whispers. Daniel rushed to obey. Richard's jaw tightened. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet sounded like an invasion. Every sound of her voice echoing through the walls like a declaration of victory. He realized with brutal clarity that if he did nothing, Clara would erase every trace of him and Linda from their own lives. The fury inside him grew, but it didn't blind him. It clarified everything. He saw each slight, each insult, each unreasonable demand not as isolated offenses, but as steps in a calculated conquest. She had pushed Linda aside, not just physically but symbolically, asserting control over both child and home. Daniel's silence confirmed the betrayal. He had chosen his allegiance, and it wasn't with his parents. Richard returned to his study that night, closing the door softly behind him. The small room felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a war room. He sat in the leather chair that had molded to his shape over decades, the familiar creak grounding him. The framed photographs on the shelf stared back at him. Images of Daniel as a child, smiling in baseball uniforms, perched on his shoulders, blowing out candles. Richard studied them not with nostalgia, but with cold assessment. Somewhere along the line, that boy had disappeared. What remained was a man hollowed by weakness, willing to stand silent while his wife humiliated his own mother. On the desk lay a yellowed notepad. Richard pulled it closer, the paper rough under his calloused fingers. He picked up a pen and began to write, not words of emotion, but calculations, reminders, fragments of a plan forming in his mind. He listed the mortgage payments, the utility bills, the groceries, every dollar that had flowed from his pocket into Daniel and Clara's life. The numbers stacked up like evidence, undeniable proof of their dependence. They thought the house was theirs, but Richard knew the truth. Every brick, every nail, every payment bore his name. He realized then that power did not belong to the loudest voice or the cruelest insult. It belonged to the one who held the foundation. Down the hall, Clara's laughter rang out shrill and grating. Richard froze, the pen pressed against the paper. That sound, so careless, so assured, only hardened his resolve. Linda had already gone to bed, her body exhausted from both the shove and the weight of humiliation. He had kissed her forehead, promised her without words that she would never endure this again. Now, in the solitude of his study, he made himself another promise. Silence was over. The night stretched long, the clock ticking past midnight, but Richard didn't close his eyes. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of Clara's footsteps, the muffled hum of Daniel's voice. Each sound etched deeper into him, each moment fueling the cold fire inside. By dawn he felt something he hadn't in years control. His fury had sharpened into purpose, and purpose was more dangerous than rage. When the first rays of sunlight broke across the yard, Richard stepped onto the porch, his coffee steaming in the morning air. The house stood behind him, still and quiet, but it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a battlefield waiting for its reckoning. He sipped the coffee slowly, his gaze sweeping across the property he had tended with his own hands. The garden Linda had planted, the fence he had built, the porch he had repaired every spring, all of it was his, and none of it would be surrendered. Richard knew Clara believed she had won, that she mistook his silence for defeat. But she had miscalculated. What simmered beneath his calm exterior wasn't weakness. It was fury biding its time, fury waiting for the exact moment to strike. And when that moment came, it would not be loud or chaotic. It would be deliberate, precise, and absolute. Clara and Daniel thought they understood the man who stood quietly in the shadows of his own home. They didn't. The man they underestimated had built his life on foundations, and no matter how polished the surface, he knew exactly how to make the ground crumble beneath their feet. The house still smelled faintly of spilled flowers, of water soaked into the wood, a reminder of the insult Linda had endured. Richard inhaled deeply, letting it anchor him. That memory, sharp and unyielding, would fuel every step forward. He set his empty cup on the railing and straightened his shoulders. The reckoning hadn't yet begun, but its shadow already stretched long across the yard. And when it finally arrived, Clara would learn what it meant to mistake a father's silence for surrender. Life has a way of testing the quiet ones. Richard's story is not just about family conflict. It is about what happens when kindness is mistaken for weakness, when silence is exploited instead of respected. Many older adults know this feeling too well, giving without measure only to discover that gratitude can turn into entitlement. The lesson is clear. Sacrifice is noble, but it must be balanced with boundaries. A home built on decades of effort and love should never become a stage for humiliation. Standing firm is not about anger. It is about dignity, about protecting the years of work and love that shaped a family's foundation. As we age, our voices should not be silenced. They should carry more weight because they come from experience and wisdom. Richard's fury was not reckless. It was the awakening of a truth he could no longer ignore. Respect must be earned, and silence must never be mistaken for surrender. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more powerful stories that reflect life's hardest lessons and deepest truths.